Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the 5th Annual 2021 Institute for American Indian Education Summit. It's with great pleasure, great honor, and just good feelings overall to be here with all of you. I'm happy to see your faces on the screens, to see your names on the list, and I am so honored to be here to speak to you and welcome to you on behalf of the Institute for American Indian Education outstanding exemplary faculty and staff. This is one of the best groups I have ever worked with and will continue to work with. They are an amazing group of people and we are so lucky to have them. They are all so smart. They love their communities. They care about education. They work from the heart and from the mind and from the soul. And to me, that is probably the best that we can ever offer our students that we teach here at UNM, and hopefully all the communities that we work with. So ta'a, anam pi'uwain, anam u'uwain. Thank you, my children. I appreciate you all. I really do. So today what we're going to do is we have a very robust agenda. And I would like to start off by asking Mr. Governor, former governor and current chairman, Wilfred Herrera, to do the invocation. And then we will follow that up with the welcome by our Dean Hansel Burley. Mr. Herrera?
Kawati hopa. Pa wana tawa straight gas tawa sopen tawana mahit. So na wait kayute. No ta na stus at amuma nitra na stus hopa. Washo na. Tawa has na next year. Gatana kupishta. I'd say get bo koa ha. You know, no just sure tahu kaso shuni tayusha. Kayuchen. Etawai miuna. We kayuche. Miuna kuna tasaya watcha. Mish kayo kaijo it's na next year. Gatana kupishta. Kuna ta sharpju. Shogo and Joanuma. Et wait eshe. Ewa jemi. After me kume nidrana shoes. New test shoes. No jet rachimas hopa. That's each. That's gaujemische. Goldenya. That's was from Estani. Go no tandrana shoes. Goldenya. Wait eshe. Yani ewa 2 million. That was Snajak. We shop at Snajak. Which had to go shots. Kawasa. Et heme ete. Naya just chinako. That's strashe. That's tawa jisti, Jenny. Shepherds, Jamie Marsha, a Gawa Johnny. After me kume hopa, iske tapa, iske winners for hopa, Saya Martini. I know hearty, James, Josh, Gold in your cuttles in you. Tawa is the west at Guisha. At Joshia, hopa. Tawa, it's a 2 Jamie Marsha Scrooge. The way my Palma, da says, show me Hannah. Down that go, da pair. Na, so, nay with you, hopa. The Jamie shako. I would Jimmy, new gestures. Hopa has the mekume. The 2 Jamie Master Scrooge. Down that go, da pair. Na. Thank you.
Ta'an Damina, Ta'ayuna. Malay. Thank you very much, Father, for doing this. We appreciate this. Thank you very much. Means a lot. We needed this right now. So thank you. So I would like to welcome Dr. and Dean Hansel Burley to do the welcome. And here he is.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. And to all of you all, welcome. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the 5th Annual Summit hosted by the Institute for American Indian Education. I also want to welcome our esteemed panelists, Navajo Council Delegate Daniel So, All Pueblo Council of Governors Chairman Wilfred Herrera, Central Consolidated Elementary Educator Miss Andrea Thomas, and Gallup McKinley County School Superintendent Dr. Mike Hyatt, and all of our educators, tribal leaders, legislators, and community members. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the land on which the University of New Mexico is situated. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Puebla of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. All right, this year's summit is set to address the theme, looking to 2022, finding strategies at work. Since Judge Sarah Singleton's ruling on the Yazzie and Martinez versus the state of New Mexico ruling in 2018, legislation has been introduced to implement educational remedies. However, numerous significant bills to carry out these remedies in 2019, 2020, and 2021 have not reached the governor's desk for signature. Is our strategy working? This summit will re-examine and refine the framework of legislative strategies designed to serve our children of New Mexico. For them, we need strategies that maximize our advocacy, resources, and educational capacity. Thank you all for your commitment and active participation in serving Indigenous nations and peoples. And my appreciation to the Planning Committee, Dr. Terry Flowerday, Dr. William Holmes, Dr. Wendy Greyeyes, Dr. Lord Lee, Ms. Brianna Fragua, and Dr. and Director Glenova Martinez. Thank you all. And you all have a great summit.
Thank you, Dean Burley. Thank you very much for those nice words. I appreciate that. The land acknowledgement. That's really nice to see that. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and proceed now. As we said before, this particular session is to do a legislative analysis of the Martinez-Yazzie legislation that's connected to the lawsuit of the Martinez-Yazzie case. And we wanted to make a connection to the summit that we had in 2020, and that was also a virtual summit, as many of you may have attended, and you should have received the post-summit report on the Yazzie Martinez ruling in the packet with today's, with everything for today. And we wanted to just call your attention to some of the major issues that were brought up in that executive summary. This summary was created by many of the same people who are in this planning committee and more. One of the things that we did at that executive summary was we asked two basic questions. Are the remedies in Judge Singleton's ruling being met? What else is needed to not only comply with the ruling, but to transform public education for American Indians in the state? And number two, are equity councils a sufficient response or relief to the Yazzie Martinez court decision? And in that report, what we did, or in that summit last year, was we had breakout sessions, we had note takers, we had facilitators, and we heard what you had to say. And we basically consolidated and we coded all of the information we'd got. And these are some of the results that we came up with. And again, you can take a look at this 6-page executive summary for more information. So I'm just going to point out what the major concerns or comments or themes that were identified in response to these two questions. First of all, funding is a major concern, was one of the results. Number two, the New Mexico Public Education Department needs to be accountable. Number three, communication must be inclusive. Number four, educator preparation needs to be improved. Number five, curriculum and instruction has to be culturally responsive. So those were the themes that we identified from all of the breakout sessions. So IAIE then developed a set of 6 recommendations in response to the concerns that were raised at the summit by these summit attendees. And if you have your executive summary, it starts on page 4. The first recommendation is the need for sustainable funding. Number 2, we need to hold the New Mexico Public Education Department accountable. Number 3, we need to intensify communication outreach. Number 4, we must improve educator preparation. Number 5, we need to increase support for curriculum and instruction. And number 6, there needs to be a critical review of existing laws related to the Yazzie Martinez ruling, but also all those are in line to Judge Singleton's order. And this particular executive summary really set the context for the 2021 legislative, or the 2021 summit. The Planning Committee and IAIE in general wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening. We have followed, as many of you who have been testified or were expert witnesses have seen, for example, duplicate legislation being introduced in 2020 and 2021, but they never get past sometimes committee. Oftentimes they are tabled or it's voted, but it never gets even as far as to the governor's office for her signature or veto. So we have to ask the question, what's going on here? Why is it that all the legislative efforts that many of our very hardworking, good-hearted legislators are doing, our senators and representatives are doing, why aren't we able to operationalize the remedies that were set out in this historically, politically significant ruling by Judge Sarah Singleton in 2018? So that was the premise for this particular summit. Now we are blessed in many ways as IAIE, and I always recognize this. I think about this when I walk in the morning, and I think about this. I'm always thinking about IAIE. I have to say that it's centered to my work here. I'm blessed to be surrounded by a number of highly enlightened, intelligent, smart professors. And collectively, under the leadership of Dr. Wendy Grayeyes and Ms. Brianna Fragua, they set up this particular PowerPoint to begin a discussion of looking at doing a legislative analysis, not to grade legislators to say Derek Wente gets an A and so gets a B. That's not the idea, but to focus on the legislation itself. What's in the legislation? How can we quantify what's happening? And you're going to see Brianna and Wendy working together, they looked at 107 pieces of legislation, which were bills, memorials, resolutions, all different types of pieces of legislation. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm very excited about this. Okay, so here's a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. It's basically set into 4 sections. And we thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the state legislature, just a refresher course. It's interesting, I taught government for many years, like 17 years, I think, total as a teacher. And here I am teaching it again. And I keep thinking about when I taught 9th graders, we always said JEL, judicial, executive, legislative, and that may ring a bell for many of you. Okay, so the state of New Mexico, as we know, has a 3-branch system. We have an executive branch with the New Mexico Governor's Office, with a number of 33 departments and offices to execute the responsibilities of the Senate. We also have a judicial branch, and that basically consists of the New Mexico Supreme Court and a series of other courts, district courts, court of appeals, whose main job is to study the constitutionality of bills or to study the judicial significance of bills. So their job is to review and to look at bills from a judicial perspective, a legal perspective. So they may be asked to review if a bill is signed into law. There may be people contesting it, and it may eventually make its way through the appellate court system to the Supreme Court, New Mexico Supreme Court, and they make a decision whether or not it is constitutional or unconstitutional. The legislative branch that we have in New Mexico is referred to as a bicameral legislature, meaning that we have 2 chambers. We have the House of Representatives, and in New Mexico we have 70 members. and they run every 2 years. Their terms are 2 years. And then we have the Senate, which has 42 members, and their office is every 4 years. The major job of the state legislature, as you know from your government classes, is to make laws. Their job is to take the bills from the Senate, from committees, and move it through both chambers of the New Mexico State Legislature. And so there's a whole process here, and I like the way right here has just basically put into one bullet. A bill is the form of legislation to propose laws. A bill may originate in either chamber, meaning the House or the Senate, but in order to become law, it must be passed by both houses, by both the House and the Senate, and signed by the governor. A General Appropriation Act allocates money to fund the state government. So if any of you ever go to legislation, that's usually House Bill 2, or the number is 2, usually for the General Appropriation Bill. There are a number of other ways that the legislature operates. Resolutions, which is like a formal declaration by the legislature concerning some subject. There's resolutions, of which there's 3 types. There's a joint, concurrent, or simple, and they require no action on the part of the governor. A joint resolution can propose an amendment to the Constitution of New Mexico and must be approved by New Mexico voters to pass. Concurrent just means it's used for the purpose of adopting or amending joint rules of the state legislature. And a simple resolution, just by note, is seldom used. A memorial is something that you're probably more familiar with. This is an expression of legislative desire that is usually addressed to another governmental body in the form or of a petition or declaration of intent. If you go to the site, you can basically see that there are a number of memorials that are proposed. But memorials are introduced. They can be passed by both houses, which is a joint memorial, or a simple memorial, which is an expression of only one legislative chamber, the House or the Senate. All right, so for the next of the slides, we're going to go ahead and go to Wendy, who is going to cover methodology.
So Dr. Martinez had mentioned a little of what we collected. What we did is we took all those 107 pieces of legislation, and as she described, we put them into the categories of memorials, of bills, of resolutions, and tried to really think about which of those bills were chartered, which ones died, how much funding was associated to them, because 107 bills that had anything mentioning Yazzie Martinez or Martinez Yazzie was very critical in thinking about, how a lot of the information that was being shared was justifying the actions of the state legislature. And we recognize that this is just one strategy. And so as we went through, Brianna was the one who pulled a lot of the FIRs, the Legislative Education Committee reports, the actual final bills that were drafted, and put them into this huge Excel file. So that's what we built our coding around, but also downloaded those documents. So we looked just specifically at 2019, 2020, 2021, and then the 2020 special session.
So if you look at the slide, Martinez Yazzie legislative related funding, you can see that we have indicated the total funding requested in the first column and total funding received in the second column for the last 3 years. So for 2019, 2020, and 2021. And I would like you to look first at the bottom one, which is 2019. And I'll just make some comments. In 2019, there was approximately $1,652,000 put forward, requested in funding. And of this, about 31%, or 519,000, a little more, was actually funded. So as I said, that's approximately 31%, which is less than 1/3 of the funding requested was actually ended up being funded. In 2020, approximately $441,000 was requested or put forward, and about 60,270-ish was actually funded, which is about 14%, or about a seventh of what was being asked for was actually funded. And in 2021, about $684,000 was requested. And of that, about 159,200 was actually funded, which comes out to about 9%, or less than a tenth. In summary, what this shows is that the amount of funding that's actually been put forward, that's been requested, has decreased. So from over $1.5 million in 2019 to 440,000, back up a little bit to 684,000 this last year. But even though the requested amount has decreased significantly, the amount that's been funded has actually decreased even more. So in 2019, for example, almost a third of the money requested was actually appropriated, was actually awarded. In 2020, it was down to about 14% that was actually funded of what was requested. And this last year, it was down to about 9% that was actually funded. So those are kind of the highlights and the ways that you can think about interpreting this information.
So on this particular slide, we looked at the legislation itself and broke it down into the different areas, if they were a bill or a memorial or a joint memorial or a resolution, and kind of really saw where the breakdown was in terms of the differences in terms of the legislation, whether it was a bill that was requesting funding or memorial or joint resolution or resolution that wasn't necessarily. So out of the 107 pieces, you can see the breakdown there on the slide in terms of the years, how much legislation was introduced. So there were 34 in 2019, 42 in 2020, and then 31 in 2021. So out of that number, there were 23 memorials, 2 resolutions, and 82 bills that were initiated to address Martinez Yazzie. You can see on the chart there, the breakdown in terms of those specific bills and memorials and resolutions. There's a discrepancy in terms of what these legislations are related to and whether or not they were requesting funding.
So what we wanted to look at as well is to think about the sponsorships in terms of the results of this House and Senate memorials. As we've learned, and I welcome Ms. Dameron if she wants to comment on this, is that memorials are generally a way of the state legislature communicating to its internal government structure. So, so they would give directives or to highlight specific things that would promote particular topics that were important for either the House or the Senate, or as Glenn had mentioned earlier, sometimes they were joint memorials that occurred. But what we saw in terms of co-sponsorship, there were a lot of these memorials that had gone through the House and Senate. The legislation with 12 House and Senate memorials, as you can see, really had a lot of this co-sponsorship. And so in this, we highlighted the title of the House bill, or excuse me, the memorial. And I realized we should have inserted the memorial number on those, but we can fix that later. But as you can see, that 5 were only signed, that 9 House and Senate joint memorials went through the House or the Senate. So this, I think, is a really important analysis that adds to our discussion, because, you know, when we think about memorials and what role they play in thinking about one strategy that's utilized by the state legislature to resolve the Martinez and Yazzie lawsuit, we wanted to really think about what this situation tells in terms of the story, especially over the past 3 years. And then in here, this slide, it's kind of bleeding off a little bit. But we also looked at the chaptered bills only, meaning that there were 16 House bills passed in 2019, bills that were passed on both sides of the legislature, and the 5 House bills that are chaptered are approved by both sides and signed by the governor. And those that did not make it through the passage of the legislature really highlighted some of the projects that really got pushed through. As you can see, this provides a listing of those that were co-sponsored and sole sponsored that were chaptered bills only. We might have to actually tweak this PowerPoint just a little bit because it's not showing up. But in terms of thinking about this process, we wanted to think about that relationship over time. How many of these bills actually make it through the entire process, the entire cycle? Because I think one of the questions that we thought about is, we only have a number of amount of precious energy in terms of our intellectual, our emotional labor, and the number of players that actually come to the table to testify, to serve as witnesses to these bills. And those bills generally are a very powerful tool in thinking about getting the support needed to actually fulfill the obligations required and articulated by Judge Singleton to address some of these issues that are hard-hitting in terms of that process. So we wanted to kind of think about, okay, how many of these bills that have gone through the legislation, particularly for House bills and Senate bills, how many of them made it through to be chaptered, right? So what we also developed is when you really look at the big gamut of all the different bills, 107 pieces of legislation, what we did is utilize a tool called Atlas TI, which is a coding tool to go through and think about all of those 107 pieces. How many of those actually targeted the heart and soul of Judge Singleton's ruling? As you guys met, as we've talked about extensively, and as we saw in the report, much of Judge Singleton's hope was to really address some of the English language learners, college and career readiness. So we did recognize that much of the legislation, where did they fall in that spectrum? So we did the coding of all those 107 pieces of legislation to identify all the different programs, all the different planning projects, all the different indices that were being generated from this project. And we came up with these 5 themes that were generated of college and career readiness, culturally relevant courses, the community preparedness for college and career readiness, the NMPED planning and preparedness, and then the Martinez Yazzie education funding disparity. So a lot of these fell into those different camps. And as we think about these codes, we had about 56 generated codes, but I would say these were like the parent codes that actually help identify where most of the legislation was falling. So in this next section, I won't go too much into the details.
And I'd like to introduce Dr. Damron. Dr. Damron is the Director of Government Relations for the University of New Mexico, and we are very honored by her presence here. And she's worked with us on a number of initiatives, but we're so happy to have her here for the 30-minute time. So Dr. Damron, would you like to add any commentary or anything you want to talk about up to this point?
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez and Wendy, and thank you all for your dedicated work in light of many challenges. I've been honored that Dr. Martinez looped me into here to work with this great group of faculty and staff on this project. So happy to serve in any way that is beneficial to you. So great job, of course, that Wendy and Brianna did getting all these bills together and such. I do want to frame a couple things. Of course, the majority of bills that are introduced or dropped, as we call it in the legislature, don't ever get to the finish line. The vast majority don't. This particular session was one of the lowest amounts of bills that was ever introduced in general, just around 900 bills. Using a 60-day session, we'll have 1,600 bills, but given the virtual nature of this past session, back in 19, we had more bills. And that was also, I think, represented as what you see in here. So no, first of all, the majority of bills that get introduced don't ever get to the finish line because each bill has to go through its own chamber, its chamber of origin, then has to cross over to the other chamber. And if there's any changes made to that bill in the other chamber, then it has to come back to the chamber of origin. All that has to happen before it goes to the governor for her signature or veto. Nonetheless, I think it's quite interesting that there were 107 pieces of legislation. Also, as has already been mentioned to you, resolutions, memorials don't carry any appropriations with them, so they're not very robust. They don't really have a lot of authority for different agencies to do things about them because they're usually unfunded mandates, and so hence that work that's called out in memorial or resolution does not always get addressed. Nonetheless, this is an excellently done analysis to see what's happened with the bills that were introduced that targeted Martinez Yazzie lawsuit. What are we doing in our state to address it? The legislative process. And again, remember, the legislature creates the laws, the decisions, what to do with the money, and the executive side carries that out. So clearly analysis here of the 107 pieces of legislation that passed, as was nicely presented in the slide about the percentages of money that was actually appropriated there from 14% down to less than 10%, shows that there's still a lot of talk and not a lot of action in this space. So I just really want to commend Dr. Martinez and her colleagues for the excellent work they're doing. I think this analysis is superb. We need to get it published, but it will also help us really strategize and target further how we, through IAIE and UNM, can help the state get to where it needs to be to address the issues that were called out in Martinez Yazzie legislation. Thank you so much for this time.
So I'm not going to go too much into the details of this, but this is really the rubric that we constructed, because as we were organizing all the different legislation, we kind of dug in. So this really details the definitions of how we kind of put the amounts to each of the initiatives. We did see that although legislation mentioned college and career readiness, it really did not tackle the heart and soul of the Yazzie Martinez. We also saw legislation that had a direct impact, meaning they had a strong focus on preparing students for entry-level courses. And so you saw some of these legislation, I mean, there's 107 pieces. You're gonna hit so many different realms, but we wanted to really think about which are the hard-hitting, direct impacted, immediate relief type of initiatives. And then we also have the indirect ones, which we recognize really took some time. You know, they were situations where they changed graduation requirements for high school students. They, you know, reduced some of the graduation requirements, or, you know, situations that we knew would take time to actually fulfill. And so these are kind of coded as the numerical like system that we utilize. So we'll go ahead and leave that with you guys to read through. But I think the slide that we really wanted to tackle is a few slides down. So these are the definitions. So when we went through, as you can see, those 6 areas, well, we left the state constitutional amendment out, but going from the top, from college career ready, when we dug into each of the legislation, we saw that, you know, there was concepts of adding 140 hours to the school year, college and career readiness programs for an RFP, digital media programming. So we saw these indirect impact in this category, really addressing some of the delayed responses to actually resolve Yazzie Martinez. And as you guys remember, Yazzie Martinez was about addressing systematic disenfranchisement of Native students. So, you know, we thought a lot about what's going to take some time in terms of actual deployment, actual planning, actual implementation. And so that indirect impact is kind of that category. And then the direct impact, the immediate remedy element, as we read through all the different programs, the legislation brought up things like academic success programs, career and STEM programs, K-12 STEM, cultural relevancy, dual credit program, and so forth. So, you know, as we looked at that, you know, those were some of the programs that really tackled the heart and soul of what Judge Singleton's expectations were. The next category that we examined were the community preparedness. There was a lot of legislation that talked about high-speed internet, technical assistance centers, tribal libraries and education centers, health, social support services, education resource centers, and so forth. I mean, not only is that college career readiness just focused on the classroom, we started to see it scaling out into the community because students have to return back to their communities. And if the resources aren't available in the community to actually help continue and promote college career readiness aspect, then students really do lose out. And then we saw a third category, another strong theme of culturally relevant, a lot of requests for curriculum development centers, native language programming, and so forth. So those were wanting to get on the ground to start moving forward. And then the funding increases. We saw a lot of immediate relief that was being provided in these legislations. So amending public school funding formulas, the federal impact aid funding repurposing, funding for PAD to provide evidence for college and career readiness. And then you can kind of see in the left column, the funding increase one, things that would take time, and amending the definition of education technological infrastructure, bus driver salary, increased teacher salaries, so forth. Even though these were, helping to help retain teachers at that moment, it would still take time for them to continue to address some of those concerns. The other theme that we really saw being generated from a lot of the legislation is the state education agency planning, which we retitled to New Mexico Public Education Department Planning and Preparedness. And what that means is that we saw a lot of legislation that talked about building these indexes, building blueprints, building these workforce task force groups, these commissions, and then more and more planning, because even though one of the analysts that had written in one of the legislative reports had stated that education itself is the remedies that were provided from Judge Singleton's ruling, there was no clear remedy that was addressed. There was a lot of the challenges that were confronting in MPED and the schools and the teachers and what was impacting the students, a lot of the layout of the problems, but there was no clear strategy, no clear remedy that was articulated. And so there was a lot of responsibility being pushed upon the New Mexico Public Education Department to do a lot of this planning. So that's kind of what we used as our rubric to really evaluate the results of the analysis. So there's 5 targeted legislation. So going back to the targeted Martinez-Yazzie legislation, what we uncovered were what were the direct responsive Martinez-Yazzie legislative, and we only looked at 2021 since it's still fresh in our memories, was that we had Senate Bill 337, the workplace preparation school programs, which really hit at one of the heart and soul of Judge Singleton's bill. You guys should have received a listing of all the bills, so you can kind of see who the sponsors are for that one. But in terms of thinking about that piece, it actually ended up landing at the current location of the Senate Education Committee. So it kind of didn't get chaptered. So, but it was a bill that we thought really amplified some of the goals of the college and career readiness. The second one was House Bill 87, the Yazzie lawsuit, higher education funding. In that bill, what we saw was that there was a lot of the ideas that were generated from that, which was co-sponsored by Derek Lenti, Georgine Lewis, Wanda Johnson, and Patricia Rodel Caballero. We saw that some of these initiatives of the Yazzie lawsuit for higher education funding really tackle some of the hard-hitting elements of what Judge Singleton had brought up. And one thing that we did see in the analyst's remarks was that higher education isn't viewed as a direct linkage to K through 12. And this information helps us to think about what is the role of higher education, because in the analyst's remark, they stated that Judge Singleton was focused on the K through 12 environment, and mentioned a little bit about the role that higher education played. And we thought that was really unfair in terms of that perspective being put out, because there is a linkage of higher education that gets linked back into the K through 12 environment in terms of training teachers, providing curriculum, providing a lot of the resources that are necessary for a K through 12 environment to succeed. And then we saw the next portion of this was the culturally relevant courses, House Bill 86, the Native American Library, Internet and Education, and then the Senate Bill 337 again propped up. But the House Bill 86, which was co-sponsored by Derek Lenti, Georgine Lewis, Wanda Johnson, and Patricia Roybal, that didn't get chaptered again, but it ended up in the House Appropriations and Finance Committee. And, but we saw that it was tackling some of the elements that, a lot of our communities desire. Again, Senate Bill 337 had also been brought up again. Then community preparedness for college and career readiness. As you guys remember, those were, like the internet, the libraries, and so forth. So House Bill 86 and House Bill 87. In House Bill 86, that again was led by Derek Lenti, Georgine Lewis, Wanda Johnson, and Patricia Roybal Caballero. And that didn't see any traction, was not chaptered at all, but ended up again in the House Appropriations and Finance Committee. And, we saw this as really addressing some of these areas. And then the NMPED planning and preparedness. We saw here that the preparedness of House Bill 337 and then the House Bill 2119, which had the sponsorship of Joy Garrett and Christine Trujillo, that tackled the Bioliteracy Development Framework Task Force. And again, the current location for that it was never chaptered. There is a fifth part of this PowerPoint slide, and in that slide is the Martinez-Yazzie education funding disparity, which was House Bill 6, and that was a state equalization guarantee distributions. And that bill was actually co-sponsored by Patricia Lundstrom, Brian Egolf, Harry Garcia, and Wanda Johnson. And that was one of the few that got chaptered. And in the bill itself, it really talked a little bit about, that's House Bill 6. So this related to education finance. So this was really about bringing state equalization guarantees to offset the federal and property taxes for the Martinez-Yazzie. And then you had House Bill 116 for the final Martinez-Yazzie, which was the additions to the 3-tiered teacher system. And in that particular bill, that was not chaptered. That was sponsored by Elizabeth Thompson, and that ended up in the House Appropriations and Finance Committee. So we're seeing a lot of bills that really hit at the heart of Martinez-Yazzie's, Judge Singleton's ruling in terms of the lawsuit, but in terms of actually getting through and making it and not dying along the way, but actually getting chaptered. Saw a lot of those very, very important bills just falling to the wayside. So the question that comes back to all of us is to think about, we only have a limited amount of resources. We only have a limited amount of energy that each of us carries as individuals. And so we wanted to reflect back on all of the legislation that's been passed and to think about why are so many of these legislations that really tackle the heart and soul of Martinez-Yazzie's, why are they dying? Why are they not getting through? Why aren't they getting chaptered? Why aren't they getting funded? And what are we doing wrong that a lot of these are falling to the wayside? So this is kind of the heart and soul of our conversation today. And I'll go ahead and let Dr. Martinez go to the questions themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. That was very good. Dr. Damon, before you leave us, would you like to make any comments on the last part of it? Or do you want to go back on any of the slides?
Yes, I would like to make a few comments. And again, I'm keep clearing out my calendar. I'm telling you because this is so very interesting. I'm going to stay on as long as I can. So very good points. Of course, Dr. Gurria's work was great, but very good questions that are being asked. Why did some of these get stuck in committee? Why didn't they cross chambers? Why didn't they not get to the governor's desk for her to sign for them to be chaptered? Because of course they can't be chaptered unless she signs them. So as I look at all this and having worked in government for a long time in Texas and Washington, D.C. and in here, I think part of the issue is Yazzie Martinez does not have like one main person organizing all this. The bills are coming from a variety of different entities, different interest groups, going through a variety of different legislators. I mean, you'll notice, of course, when chair of House Appropriations, Chairwoman Lundstrom, her bill got all the way through. Why? Because it's a good bill and one, but she's also chair of House Appropriations. And so please understand that there are so many really good bills, not just in the area we're talking about today, but even outside of this, that never see the light of day because there's no one there working these bills. These bills are like, it's like a project. You have to work every single one, every single UNM bill, both when I was cabinet secretary and now working bills at UNM. I work every single bill. Decide ahead of time which bills I'm going to champion. And when I was cabinet secretary, 100% of my bills got passed. I was working in a Republican administration with a fully Democrat legislature, even though I'm independent. So all those bills got passed. Why? Because I championed each. I had a whole process, because many times very good bills get caught and stuck in committee that has nothing to do with the quality content of the bill itself. They get caught in all the political issues that go on during the session. And I guarantee you that's where lots of these bills did get caught. They got caught in issues that were going on during the session that had nothing to do with the quality of the bills, the importance of the bills, the necessity of the bills. So one thing, the more I'm listening to y'all through this and talking with you, I think it'd be great for this group to decide, which bills next session. Well, next session is going to be a short 30-day session. It's going to be a budget session, but nonetheless, these are all budget ramifications. I think one thing is this group can decide, do you use a group want to target a handful of some of these same bills or new bills, and then you pick sponsors very carefully, and then you work with the leadership proactively long before the session starts, that this is a bill we want to get all the way to the finish line. And I don't know that these bills had anybody strategizing and guiding that through it. Does that make sense, Dr. Martinez?
Yes, it did. And I'm really glad you said that, because it almost, I have 3 examples here of 3 legislative pieces that were introduced 2 years in a row in 20 and 2021, same legislation. So we have one that has to do with an act to make appropriations to state institutions of higher ed and tribal colleges to comply with the court's rulings in consolidated Martinez and Yazzie v. State of New Mexico by improving educational outcomes for certain public school and higher education students and families. This was introduced in 2020 and 2021. Never went further than that. Another one.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, so that bill, I heard about some doing this, but again, each bill needs one person. You're selling something. I mean, each bill really needs one leader to take that bill and work with all the various stakeholders around that bill, both those of us who are not legislators, all the different stakeholder groups, and then to work through trust me, every bill has a strategy of who introduce, which sponsor you choose, when it gets introduced, these bills don't just show up on committees on their own. We strategically work to get all these on their own, on the committees with that, not on their own. It takes work on each one of those. So keep going, Glenn Box. I think this is interesting for us to look at these. I think maybe this group would decide which ones of this do you want to do? And then we'd have several routes. One, either UNM can decide to assign that to UNM government relations to do it, or we can get an outside entity, but I think there's avenues with that. But keep going with those bills, Dr.
Well,
Martin.
okay, I mean, we can bring it up another time. I just wanted to give an example of the things that you were talking about, that it does take leadership. It does take a steward in a way to kind of take that throughout the process. So, all right.
Dr. Martinez, this is Chairman Herrera.
Yes,
Could I make a couple of comments while we have Dr. Damon on the presentation at this point?
Yeah, we have about 2 minutes. Chairman.
Okay, very briefly, again, I'm going to reference what was provided on the 3 branches of government. And in these 3 branches of government, from what I'm hearing from this analysis and the comments from Damon, is that are the 3 branches of government demonstrating lack of adherence to the process that the three levels of government use, or 3 branches of government use. It seems like they're not using the process, and they're not making the best use of the process. The reason I say that is it's looking like there's maybe a lack of communication and a disconnect among the 3 branches, because it seems like instead of one process, it appears that each one is using a separate process. And the reason I say this is that depending on what their intelligence tells them or what they use to get information regarding the how these bills are moving through the legislative, efforts. The one that stands out to me is the dollars that are being requested. Maybe each branch does not understand fully, because we've also heard that instead of going for the amounts that we're seeking, they tend to say in some aspects, let's do a phased approach. It's a lot misleading, because then it means that we're going to put this off till another time. So I use this word of communication, lack of, possibly a very distinct disconnect between the three branches. And then it results in a breakdown in the process, which appears to be, in my view, what has occurred. So I agree with Damon's comment about through this summit and some of these efforts and these discussions, we can help to fix the process or align it to where it's better understood and better utilized to achieve the results we're seeking. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Herrera. Dr. Damron?
Yes, Mr. Chairman Herrera, you hit the nail on the head, very precise. So there is a disconnect amongst our three branches of government. Now, part of that is intentional, because that's our checks and balances. So we want some disconnect so they can each question the other. The problem is this is human behavior and this is politics. And so the miscommunication amongst the branches is many times purposeful. Because there are people who don't want certain bills passed, or people don't want money going to certain entities, and they use this process to get what they want. That is, stopping the money going to places where we want it to go, for example, and they don't want it to go. So it's not just a lack of communication, it's purposeful, sometimes lack of communication. And as I'm saying, and I'm honestly hesitant to say a lot on some of this recording will go out there. So I'm trying to keep this as diplomatic as possible, but that tension, especially between the executive and legislative branches of our government, because they're constantly working together and with tension between them, and the judicial will step in later, as was the case with Judge Singleton on this. But again, there are many good bills that don't get to the finish line strictly because of politics. I'm not talking about this executive or this legislature. Let me go back in the past in my experience in New Mexico and Texas and the United States legislature as well. There are many times a really good bill is not signed by the executive because that executive did not like the legislature who carried the bill, or was a different party or a different belief. So yeah, thanks, Glenn. So I'm just saying what you observed, Mr. Chairman Herrera, is exactly correct. And that's why I'm saying you need a leader and a champion to know how to navigate that, because those of us who do this for a living know where those problems are. We go in behind the back door and say, look, governor or legislator, no, you don't like the other one, but let's not let this be a pawn in that. Much more to say about that, but thank you, Mr. Herrera. Thank you, Dr. Martinez.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Damron. So I guess we'll go ahead and move on to the next part of our panel, our summit, which is the panel. And I would like to introduce our panelists. But I also want to thank, again, everybody who was here. So we are honored to have 4 outstanding leaders, educators, tribal chair people in our community of New Mexico. And I'm going to read a brief bio for each one of you. So I'll start off with Ms. Andrea Thomas. Ms. Andrea Thomas is a teacher leader from Shiprock, New Mexico in the Four Corners area of the Navajo Nation. Through her 8-year career, she has been a looping teacher who guided 2 cohorts of students from 3rd through 5th grade. As a member of the Navajo Nation Board of Education and through her participation in several outreach programs with the New Mexico Department of Education and regular participation in school board deliberations, she has coordinated the efforts of these education stakeholders. She is also a big celebrity on New Mexico True. She was featured several years ago, and my students think she's a star. So I just thought I'd just throw that in. Welcome, Ms. Thomas. I'm so happy you're here. Our next presenter is Governor Wilfred Herrera. Mr. Herrera is a member of the Pueblo of Laguna and is also one half Cochiti Pueblo. He is a graduate of Laguna Acoma High School and earned a BBA from Fort Lewis College and holds a Master's of Public Administration from the University of New Mexico. His work and service has focused on fostering and building partnerships in areas such as government, education, economic development, and youth and elder initiatives. Advocacy and working to ensure recognition, identity, protection, and sustain our native languages and language is a major part of his work. On December 31st, 2020, he completed his 2-year term as governor for Pueblo of Laguna. He has served as vice chairman of the All Pueblo Council of Governors and currently serves as the chairperson. The APCG is comprised of 19 Pueblo nations in New Mexico and Isleta del Sur and El Paso, Texas. Welcome, Governor. Our next honored guest is Superintendent Mike Hyatt. Superintendent Hyatt is the Gallup-McKinley County School Superintendent. He has served in public education in New Mexico for 23 years. He's a graduate of UNM with a degree in chemistry and a minor in mathematics, and graduated with a master's of business administration from Western New Mexico University. He has worked in the Zuni Public School District as an administrator and in the Gallup-McKinley County Schools as a teacher and administrator. He is currently in his 5th year as the superintendent of Gallup-McKinley County Schools. And Mike, if you don't mind, I'd like to also say that you have been a huge advocate and important plaintiff with the Yazzie case. Thank you for your service. And our 4th panelist, and I hope he's here, I don't see him on the screen, is Mr. Daniel So. Mr. Daniel So is a community leader and activist from the Navajo Nation. He currently serves on the Navajo Nation Council and serves his community on multiple fronts, becoming a staunch advocate for anti-fracking campaigns in New Mexico. He holds a degree in agricultural science from the New Mexico State University and is additionally a citizen map maker, documenting the encroachment of the oil and gas industry on federal, public, and tribal lands in the state. Mr. So is a well-known speaker on extraction issues both in New Mexico as well as nationally. So we will go ahead. Thank you, everybody, for making time to be here. And we will go ahead and do a panel. And all of you should see the questions there that the panelists will be dealing with. We have 2 questions. What has been the overall impact of the Martinez-Yazzie ruling on your schools or the schools that serve your communities? Number 2, what does the legislative record of the New Mexico State Legislature say to you as an educator, leader, and community member about the implementation of the Martinez-Yazzie versus State of New Mexico ruling? All right, so I'd like to start off with Governor Herrera. Let's go ahead and start with you, Mr. Herrera. So I will let you go ahead and take these questions, and I assume you have the questions in front of you. I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see one another here. Okay.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. And good morning again, everyone. And appreciate everyone joining in on today's very important summit and discussions that we're initiating. Very quickly, just want to thank everyone that has been involved with the report, the analysis. It's going to be very helpful to tribal leadership. And that's the view I'm expressing this morning on behalf of our Pueblo leadership as the chairman for APCG. You know, we depend on all of you as the frontline people to provide us the ammunition that we can take forward to help advocate and do our part as leadership to address these matters. So this is another important effort that's going to be important in our work. The other is that I'm glad to hear and see that, you know, the Pueblos, Navajo Nation, the Apache nations are involved and represented, you know, in these work and discussions. Some of the things that have come to mind when I was looking at the analysis are that, as was presented again, the overview, you know, like, for example, the 107 pieces of legislation, as it was referenced, you know, it's important that we follow this chronology that you've provided and documented, but we also need to be mindful of timelines that the court has put in place. We need to hold our state government and hold ourselves, accountable and responsible for meeting specific timelines that have come out of court orders. And then if these laws are enacted, then we need to be prepared and responsive to making good on those decisions and laws to move forward. That, again, is incumbent upon us to be responsible and accountable to make sure we fulfill these commitments that have been made law. Tracking is a key that I see that this is ongoing. And right now, the scorecard, in my view, you heard my comments earlier, that I don't think we're all doing this together, particularly at the state legislature level. And then, of course, one thing that I'm interested to hear from many today are the metrics. When we go to the scorecard, I refer to it as the scorecard, we know that we're looking to 2022 in this summit theme. One of the things that comes to my mind is, can we actually go forward with even using a couple of pieces of legislation that have been enacted? The reason I say this is that we have to remember that we're very far and we're still behind. So even with efforts that are being legislated or signed into law, we're still in a catch-up, as I see it. That's the thing that concerns me about, when we make some progress, but is it really progress, or are we not even up to, where we need to be with others at this time? The remedies question that was asked earlier, are the remedies being met out of the court ruling? I would say that no, because remember also in my comments to Damon earlier, is that the three branches of government, it seems like they're not working together. And one of the demonstrations of that I can cite is that, recall the time when the state of New Mexico actually enter in the court to dismiss, and we had to address that. And that was during these discussions and laws being introduced and all this process ongoing. And then all of a sudden the state says, we want to ask the court to dismiss this. That wasn't good. It kind of upset the whole momentum and the balance progress that we were seeking. And then the most recent tech motion that the court order has now again come to light, but it appears that we continue to look to the courts to help address these matters, when all of us know that in the Constitution of the state of New Mexico, it's clearly cited what is required of the state to provide, the education across the board for everyone. And why do we always have to have this be singled out and have to fight these battles? So these are some of the things I like to again offer in my initial comments. I always have a lot to comment on, and a few more here that I would ask to note is that, in regard to education in New Mexico, what comes to light for me is, are we in a transition? How are we evolving? And the things that we're seeking and changes. And I believe Dr. Gray Eyes mentioned for example, the change and the modification of requirements that kind of happened during the COVID. This is to me very enlightening, because if education in New Mexico is in a transition, then we should all be transitioning together. Nobody be left out. We should be all evolving at all levels. The government, the communities, the school districts, the Pueblo government, everybody, the households, everyone should be evolving in the same, timeline and the same efforts to achieve the same outcomes equally. Equality, equity, parity. Many of you have heard me express those always in regard to where we need to see these on equal basis for everyone. The requirements, as we know, under the pandemic, we waived testing, we waived reporting. There's this reference made to virtual learning and even missing students. And so these are some of the things I wanted to at least mention at this time. The state of New Mexico, again, is always cited at the bottom of U.S. education, but it's not only the native students that equates to. It's the whole state. So everyone needs to understand that it's all of us that need to be concerned about public education and quality education in New Mexico. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Governor Herrera. You know what I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to just have all the presenters speak and then we'll open up for questions. How does that sound? Okay. All right, Mr. Daniel So, are you on the phone? I understand you're on participating by phone. Can you respond to us and let us know if you're there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay, would you like to, the questions that we're asking is, what has been the overall impact of this ruling on the schools that are in your community? And what are your thoughts about the legislative record that the New Mexico State Legislature as it has to deal with implementing the Martinez Yazzie versus State of New Mexico ruling?
Yes, thank you. Our students are injured and they continue to be harmed. That's what we have to realize. In a way, they aren't given the aspect of the U.S. Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They aren't given that opportunity also. And I want to relate to the presentation. What I saw missing from the presentation on the bills and those parts that basically, quote unquote, aren't chaptered. I think the key entity in this process is the Legislative Council. I think that that's who we have to continue to help guide. And so that's, and based on, they're the ones that write the legislations. And right now, what I see, we have a governor that basically is, quote unquote, the head of the New Mexico Democratic Party. And she has an agenda. And so all the other folks, the president of the New Mexico Senate, Lieutenant Howie Morales, has to abide by that agenda. And of course, Speaker Egoff. And so in that aspect, they set in their own manner, set the agenda. And in the years past, it's been, okay, let's give a few pennies to the Indian communities and let's send them on their way with their projects. This particular Yazzie Martinez transcends that. It basically holds judgment on the education system, the public education system of New Mexico. In that aspect, that's where I'm saying our students are harmed, and they continue to be harmed because there is they haven't even started to do what is called let's throw money at the problem. They haven't even started doing that. And what this initiative, and I'm so honored to be invited to participate. What we, as those folks that basically have been schooled, is to present solutions. Where New Mexico PED can't come up with the solutions, it behooves the schooled indigenous folks to provide some remedies. This is how you can help. And so in this effort, I really appreciated the context. And right now, as a registered Democrat, I get emails from the governor and her campaign. And my response is, sorry, I'm not part of your campaign. You haven't addressed education. You haven't addressed the behavioral and mental health issues that are part of the problems of Indian country. And so, and it's time we stood up right now. We know that the Democratic Party will basically be going around and saying, what's the platform? Can we have your input to the platform? Well, this is where we become activists and no longer just sit and nod our heads and let the powers be steer where where the monies flow. And so that's the part that I think I implore. And the way to do it is to go back to the home communities and say, hey, this is wrong. Can we say something? Can we put something together from the grassroots? Granted, the Navajo Nation Council can speak on behalf of the Navajo people as a whole, but the aspect is we have a certain duty as the citizen of New Mexico to say this needs to be addressed. And so in that manner, we just have to keep rolling. And way early on, when Navajos first became eligible to vote, and we thank the folks that led that leadership, it gave us an ability to say what we want to say. And through our vote and through petitions. How about a petition by the tribal nations, the citizens of the tribal nations, to start a petition to say the committees of the state legislature, the Senate and the House, we need you to enact those directives from the Yazzie Martinez, because not every one of our citizens can go to Santa Fe when these items are being addressed. Thank you for allowing me this time. That was a part of my activist role. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. So, and I hope you can stay on because I'm sure there's going to be some questions for you, okay? Thank you very much. Okay, let's go ahead and ask Ms. Andrea Thomas to comment. And Andrea?
Okay, thank you. First of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be able to participate. So I would go ahead and jump in. So teaching, I've been in the classroom, just completed my 8th year. And so far of what has been talked about is something that resonates with me as well, in having grown up in the community that I now work for. And so a lot of the conversations that we're having and why I'm so passionate about speaking on education issues is because I am a direct product of it. Having grown up on the reservation, having been raised by my grandparents, but also getting to a point where just the quality of education wasn't in the right place of what my parents wanted for me. So therefore required me to leave the community to go elsewhere. And I think that happens to a lot of places and a lot of families that become, that go on with their education or really want those opportunities for their students start to look elsewhere when that stuff's not offered to them. So a lot of the time, a lot of our students, unfortunately, are leaving their local schools, and with that, lose that opportunity to really be immersed in their culture and their teachings. And I think that those are some of the disconnects that I think that continue to still exist and are even more prevalent, especially now with the pandemic and what we've seen in the past year. And so the couple of things Mr. Herrera had said about working collaboratively, talking about starting at the top, those disconnects, those not working, not having conversations, going into the communities, not talking, bringing in different stakeholders, parents and teachers, most likely, when we're talking about education and, it is very political, but once teachers understand the role that they play, can then kind of move into what Mr. So said about, we just can't rely on them to come up with all their answers, but with bringing in that ability to utilize their stakeholders, the input, how much are they reaching out, how much do they really want the change is what they're going to really offer. And so with that goes into like looking into the tribal communities, the various, like what 23 federally recognized tribes. I mean, there's diversity. And so there's not a one size fits all. And I know that's a really overused term this past year, but if anything, honestly, I felt as a teacher, New Mexico had a really good opportunity to be innovative in their approach to dealing with the pandemic, despite all the different challenges that were presented to students. Students want to learn, educators will show up to do what they can for their students no matter what. And so, with that, if you really go directly to the source, which are the teachers who are directly in front of the students and are in the communities and talk with the parents and develop the partnerships and relationships, are really the guiding force of how we're really going to implement the change. And so going back to the question, I think that there have been some good efforts throughout the state, especially in the districts and schools that have really tried to take some proactive, efforts in trying to use the Yazzie Martinez funds in ways that are going to help to provide teachers or professional development, or to get classroom resources and materials into, directly into the classroom to the students. And those are all like quick fixes here. But I don't think, I think the big missing piece in all of that is still the collaboration that comes down into the building level and the team of people who live within that community and serve. And so with that becomes a bigger issue, I think, when it goes down and it goes into the legislator, the communication, and I think that's where earlier it was talked about the different policies and laws and other things that probably need to be changed as we start to move forward, because local control is great in ways, but at the same time, there has to be some type of accountability that comes up to ensure that. And so much of the time, and what I've heard so much from PED is like, all we do is share the information. We can't, it's not our job, it's their job and theirs. And that's where there's inequities all around, because somebody has high standards in one area, but another person has challenges, and maybe they don't quite see those, their priority right then and there is not to have those high standards, but therefore, have a missed opportunity because that's not their focus. But if there's more of a collaborative effort within districts and partnerships, just like teachers collaborate and work together, I've noticed as a teacher, the more that I work with teachers, I'm a part of the Teach Plus network, New Mexico PED teacher. Anytime I have an opportunity to work with a diversity of teachers, not within just my building, not just as my district, but through other, tribal communities, public schools, charter schools, it really starts to give you a better idea of good practices, good strategies, and some of the similarities between the population of students and families that they're serving. And then I know another thing, we talk about, I think the big effort that a lot of people have spoken about is, or it goes back to, is the equity councils, talking about collaboration. That was a good idea. And it was like, oh man, they're really going to take in these ideas. They're going to listen, and then it'll start to transform and guide, which is, I think, the idea that they had. But unfortunately, that didn't go anywhere. And the more that I talked to people, but it ended up being that there was some people who were doing some things, some people weren't. So there was I'm like, where's the accountability? Who's holding them accountable for ensuring that the equity councils are fair, have diversity within the people that they bring on? Or is it just a leadership from the top that selects the group because they want the responses they hear? So those are some of the conversations I think that when I talk to teachers, and when they're asked, when we talk about Yazzie Martinez, or we talk about these culturally responsive professional developments, what they do, there's still that question of, well, it doesn't really fit my need, or it doesn't really help me with where I'm at. And I really wish that somebody would have reached out to us and asked us directly, or partnered with different people within our communities or cultural teachers in ways that would be more effective. So all around communication and just really talk, starting from the top, really talk about accountability. We expect that from students as teachers. Teachers were expected from the principals. And so it just feels like there's at some point, there's a disconnect between continuing to be in alignment with that. So thank you.
Thank you. That was great. As a former teacher, that's awesome. Okay, last but certainly not least, we now have a superintendent, Mike Hyatt.
Thank you. I also wanted to just quickly express my appreciation for the opportunity to be on this the stage here and be able to present my thoughts and perspectives on the lawsuit as it stands now and our legislative efforts as a whole in New Mexico and our fight for equity. I think the PowerPoint really shows quite clearly, and I appreciate the presenters painting that picture of where we're at right now. The status of the lawsuit is not where we want it to be, but I think we do have to admit there have been a lot of successes that have affected students in a positive way in New Mexico, and specifically in at-risk and Native American communities, especially the ones that we serve here in our part of the state. There's other benefits too. In the past, we had a lot of districts that opposed the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit and efforts that we were seeking. One of the benefits I see and where we're at now is there's a lot of districts that actually have embraced it, that opposed it initially. There's a lot of districts that have seen that, yeah, there really were problems with equity in New Mexico, and they had several students in their districts that needed this extra funding and law changes in order to affect change with those students. And so I think that's one thing that's not talked about a lot, is there's been a change in the tide of who supports the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit and who doesn't. And so that's another win, I think, for us, because we need that kind of momentum to continue to be successful across New Mexico. My years are fairly few in the efforts to try to make change in New Mexico with respect to equity, but it's been ever more clear to me that the obstacles that are in the face of true equity are larger than maybe we all thought they were. The lawsuits are tough, but legislative change is tougher because not everybody, unfortunately, wants to do what we want to be done or what we think is right and fair. Redistribution of funding or adding funding or change is difficult because government's not designed to do things very quickly or easily. I know a lot of people get frustrated with that process. I know that I have. But I also want to acknowledge there's a lot of great legislators that have worked really hard on behalf of the solution or the remedy to this lawsuit. That many of those names have been mentioned already. But there are also many different interests, I'll say, being represented in different parts of the state that view issues and funding differently still. And so that legislative process can be very tough for many people because we know in our minds what we know should be done to fix the problems that we face and to provide equity for our students, but not everybody sees that way. And so there's a lot of compromise. There's, the capital's different. There's a textbook version of government and there's the real world. And some of that's been talked about before about the compromise, the backroom deals that happen, things happening at the last minute, things happening for reasons that have nothing to do with what the laws that are being passed, but because of other things that are happening behind the scenes. But one of the major obstacles I still think that we face in fighting for the remedy is these competing interests. There are several different camps, and I won't mention them all, but I'll mention a few. In New Mexico, there's some that think that everything's fine, the funding formulas are fine, let's not touch it, it's the best in the country. And some of those people actually designed and helped build the funding systems, and so there's an attachment to that, and they don't want it changed because they think it reflects on them. Others know that it's inequitable, but don't want to go through the pain of losing dollars to their respective areas, and don't want to see that level playing field created because it may entail them losing funding because they don't have as many of those at-risk students. Also, there's camps of mentioned before also about saving dollars. Some people are their job is just to save dollars for the state, and then some are also looking to save dollars so they can redistribute it into their particular things that they want money spent in. And so that can be difficult. And some people try to slowball or make legislation difficult to actually use to help students. I think a good example of that has been some of the the law around extended learning. There's been rules put in place that make it very difficult to use or give unions or other entities options to not allow it to happen in school districts. And so, for example, Gallup-McKinley County Schools, the union that we work with, is opposed to extended learning. And because extended learning wasn't mandated, we're in a situation where we're not able to offer and have to look for other options. So another camp really quickly is someone to deflect responsibility. The Yazzie Martinez lawsuit was speaking to the equity in New Mexico, and that the state needs to resolve that. And for example, the deflection with respect to like equity councils, and the public education department has been implementing equity councils at the district level, and equity councils are good. I think every district should be involved in seeking information and how we can become more equitable for our students. But the lawsuit was about the state's inequity. And so it almost seems like the remedy for the state is to place blame at the district level instead of taking responsibility themselves at times. And I know they're in a tough spot and they have different competing interests that they have to play in too, but we need to stay vigilant in making sure that ownership lies where it needs to be. And last, I just want to quickly mention that it's been very clear to me that we still face a level of institutional bias in the system that needs to be tackled continually. My opinion moving forward is we need to be really clear and strategic in tackling these differing interests. It becomes very difficult to fight resistance on different fronts. And there's a lot of different fronts that we face moving forward and have faced up to this point. And unfortunately, sometimes playing perfectly pleasantly in the sandbox is not always an option to find success. But I want to acknowledge that what's in our favor. Obviously, the Yazzie Martinez ruling is in our favor. That has changed the landscape of how we're able to maneuver and fight for things and given us some leverage. Also, we have a capital outlay lawsuit that also punched a big hole in the funding formulas in New Mexico and showed the inequity. And then also recently some impact aid rulings by the federal government to show that some of those funding streams the state was using were not being taken or used equitably for students in New Mexico. And so we need to use these and other things that have been successes to keep that leverage on legislators and legislative body and state entities that may resist at times to change. I also wanted to quickly mention the pandemic has, even though it has been tragic and difficult for our state and our country and the world, it has also exposed the inequity that our students face in New Mexico, specifically with technology. It was very clear that students in rural Native American communities did not have the infrastructure access. And so the pandemic really illuminated the need for making sure there is a level playing field for all students, no matter where they live in our state or what communities they choose to reside in. The last thing I want to touch on is, how do we move forward? And I think one of the things that me personally, and I think our district has seen as we have fought for legislation in different ways, is that trying to fix little parts of the system, the funding system or the formulas, may not be possible because the system is too severely broken already. And it may not have even been built on a fair foundation to begin with. And since possibly the formulas may not be fixable, we may need to look more largely at the formulas as a whole needing to be redone or overhauled. And this could be a reason why changing individual parts of the funding formula has not been as successful as we would like. It seems like every time we try to make a little change here, it causes another problem over there, or somebody doesn't want to adjust. And so an overhaul of the system is something that I think our focus should be more steered to. And I just want to thank you for allowing me to share some of my overarching thoughts on this topic.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you very much. So we heard 4 different, very diverse, but very important perspectives. What I'd like to do now is spend some time before I have some questions, but I'd like to open this up to the audience to ask questions. And I see that Mario Atencio has a question. And Mario, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I'm the vice president for the Torreon Starlink Chapter House. Our students comprise a large majority of the Cuba independent schools, and they are a plaintiff in the Yazzie Martinez. And so listening, we really, my question is, listening to Chairman So and Chairman APCG Chairman, we really need to see and wonder if there's anybody in the group that's going to take that as a firebrand issue, because looking at it, these legislation EG that didn't pass were all manipulated, and just hearing, to hear past the words is completely institutional racism. This is what it looks like, and we have to call it out. And so my understanding, my question is, at what point remedy do we have to go through the United States Commission on Civil Rights? Do we have to file a civil rights case because this is happening? Do we have to get US DOJ to compel the state to do what it's legally mandated in its constitution? That's a question I have.
That's a very good question, Mario. Well, since you mentioned Mr. Herrera and Mr. So, would you like to give an answer like within a 2-minute section? Mr. So or Mr. Herrera?
I'll yield to Mr. So first, if he's willing, and I can also respond.
Mr. So, would you like to take on the question by Mario?
Sure. For myself, if this is what it's going to take, what I'm going to do is, and with your permission, I'd like to take this PowerPoint presentation back to the members of the Navajo Nation Council, and I will ask for an approval to write to the U.S. Department of Justice and to the Civil Rights Commission, because we have a court decision that finds the state of New Mexico not having provided equal access to education. And so, yes, that would be a remedy. And we have to keep the pressure on. And that's why I am saying a petition from the citizens. And I appreciate Superintendent Hyatt's analysis, and certainly it's warranted. Way back in the 80s, I filed a suit against Cuba Independent School District, irrespective of school board membership. It went to U.S. District Court, and the court found discrimination and ordered single-member district voting. And from there came decrees that the San Juan College signed on to, and there's now 2 members of a 5-member board there. It went across the state line to Winslow and Holbrook. So that's just a way we have to keep rolling. And when the aspect of citizens not being informed about the vote process, I signed on the letter to the U.S. Justice Department, and there was several years of DOJ observations. And then from there, the state of New Mexico consented to hire Native American voter education specialists. So I come from that aspect. And if those types of remedies are needed, then I'm willing to pursue that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. So. I really like the way you answered that question, because embedded in your answer is this idea of sovereignty and the idea that we have unique political sovereign status, and it's a government to government relationship. It's not just with the state, but it's also with the federal government and all the different agencies. So I really appreciate that. Mr. Herrera, would you like to take a couple of minutes and respond?
Yes, and let me preface this by saying that since the mention was made of going to the federal government, such as the Civil Rights Commission, this encompasses more than education. So this is my response. We have to undertake positive and socially relevant efforts as Native peoples to bring about positive education, awareness, and changes. Rather than focusing on protests and conflicts we are seeing across the world, consider positive messages and actions consistent with the beliefs and values of Indigenous people. We need to foster and build trust, understanding, and partnerships that lead to finding solutions that produce positive outcomes. We need to work to overcome our differences and truly unite and work together toward equality, equity, parity in New Mexico, our United States of America, and the world. So again, encompassing that it's not only when we go to places like the Civil Rights Commission and the federal government, we have to do it comprehensively. There's a lot of matters that all intertwine with each other. So that's my response. I hope that answers the comment or question expressed. That's how I view things, and that's what I would encourage. Thank you.
Yeah, again, excellent response. I really appreciate that. So I have a question for Andrea and for Mr. Hyatt, and I'm gonna start off with Andrea. What strategy should be the focus on 2022 state legislature that will serve you and or your students? What can we do at the classroom level? What should they be focusing on?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I think first of all, thinking of the next school year, we are already aware of the challenges that we're going to be faced with. I really like what Mr. Harris said of like, even just looking at things in a very positive way. When I think of students and children, I don't lead too much with, we have all this stuff to catch up with and they're behind in all of these things. But that also leads into really looking at the child, like how do we, when we go and we start the new school year and we, most of the schools, especially the ones in the tribal communities that didn't have the infrastructure for the online resources, really teachers in the schools themselves really had to build those partnerships with their families and within the communities. And so to get the resources and get the assistance they needed, because they didn't have a lack of technology devices. And even then that was a challenge. So I think really looking at how do we identify what the needs of the students are, but that aren't focused so much on data. Like data is great, like when we have it, but I feel like I'm worried that once we go back in, it's going to be too focused on trying to get them to be tested in a way that really takes away from how do we find out what was successful in their learning environment at home? How did they adjust? How did those conversations within teachers that give the support from the districts and the administrators in ways to better support the schools and allowing them that flexibility to make their decisions within that school. But also a big thing is having, and I think that this year definitely has shown, how can we move in growing our own teachers and helping us. And I think earlier, Ms. Grayes was talking about how in the K through 12, it was focused on K through 12 and not higher education, and that's a disconnect because, the ultimate goal should be to how do these students who've come in as they're going through K through 12 have these challenges that have come up, but once they get into college, they're wanting ways to address them. But when they're there and they're addressed in ways that only see the deal with the urban life as opposed to really getting out in the communities, a lot of teachers who are then wanting to go back into the classrooms and then go and teach are not being prepared to know what they're going to face, are going to understand the politics that are happening even with the local governments, their school boards, but also like even understanding at the state level. So going back to the question about strategies, I think it's really looking at how can we better support teachers. Pay is definitely one, but that's a whole different conversation. But really looking at them and looking them as supports, like how do we directly involve them in that process? How do we pull them and get them a seat at the table? How do we listen to those unions that we are so against? What is the challenges that are happening? This school year definitely brought in a lot of challenges, and that continue to exist between unions and schools, and the communication and the collaboration that they had that then definitely impacts students. So I think that if teachers and who are there then and are better supported with giving the time to meet with families, are asked about the scheduling, are really involved with the day-to-day things, as opposed to it being only spoken with a lot of our administrators who in many cases do not reflect the communities they serve. And when that happens, or we don't have administrators that look like or understand the values of the needs that their families or are invested enough to go in and learn about them, then it causes an even more disconnect. People aren't going to want to give their child to you if you don't believe in them, if you don't want to support them, if you know that it's just going to be a challenge and I don't want to do that. So I think that, but it was exhausting as an educator this year. I can, of all the educators that are on here, if they're teaching, I mean, it was a lot. And, to then go back into extended learning and burning, I don't know. So there's all these, there needs to be more. How do we talk to them? Just saying we're going to extend the school year or you're going to have this doesn't immediately going to help fix it unless the teachers or the people who are involved in writing the grants, what is going to be needed. But instead of just having it from the top, teachers really need to be involved in that. And I think that that's going to make better implementation in the long run, as opposed to let's just do it all up here and this is what we think and then we'll see what happens and adapt. So thank you.
Yes, and it almost, Mr. Hine, we'll get to you in just a bit here, but it almost makes me think about the announcement by PED a couple of days ago about changing from we're no longer going to go to where they're teaching the students where they're at, but they're now going to be using a different pedagogy that's driven by theory. And I have to take a look at that, but it's interesting. Again, a decision from the top without consultation with teachers, I think it's not good. Well, that's just me. It's not good leadership. Mr. Hyatt, what strategies do you think we should focus on? What would you recommend to legislators to focus on really as a superintendent thinking about your faculty and staff? And then we're going to take a question by Dr. Arvizo after that.
Sure, I think I would kind of ditto what Ms. Thomas talked about in the school level. We need to apply that same thing from the state to the district level. That assessment of what do districts need, and districts should understand what classrooms need, so that when legislation is put in place or legislation is adjusted, it gives that flexibility so that classrooms, schools, districts can still be innovative, especially at this time, and be able to use that funding appropriately, especially this time coming out or towards an end of a school year that was very devastating for our students with respect to social emotional needs, with respect to their technology needs at this time, and giving parents choice in how their students receive their education. I think right now there's just a host of things that we need to continue to advocate for, and as Ms. Thomas mentioned, we need to make sure that comes from the ground level and not from superintendents or administrators. It needs to come from seeking out the needs and assessing the needs of students, every student, and then compiling that to give legislators accurate data on what we need as school districts to implement change.
Thank you, Mr. Hyatt. We have a question. I think we have time for one question, and that is from Dr. Arvizo. Dr. Arvizo, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. First of all, I'm glad that I got the information last minute to join. I go way back to on Impact Aid and also observing the lawsuit that was filed. My question is, where is UNM support? I don't see UNM as the institution visible, although I realize your organization is part of UNM, but where are the top officials? Where is the documentation? And UNM introduces a lot of legislation in reference to the university funding. They should be part of this in support. And then my other comment is we need supporting resolutions from all New Mexico tribes to be presented to the state. And I agree with many of the statements that were made, but the lawsuit is about inequity, the pandemic year that we went through. I mean, on Navajo, I read in the paper about parents who are so dedicated to have their child receive education classes per day, climb up to the mesa, buses parked way in the middle of nowhere, trying to get internet connection. And we've been saying this for years. And I think the civil rights legislation lawsuit is something that needs to be pursued. We need to come out big. And it's true, the system is there. The system is old, just like the BIA system is so old that it's a big volcano rock that you can't even move. But we need to take bigger steps, 10 steps forward, maybe 1 step back, just to review. We need to be bold in the actions. You know, there's New Mexico state legislatures, when they introduce their bill, they are ready. They follow the bills. They have runners daily. They have people talking to and meeting to make sure the bills get through. What is going on with this bill? Do we have runners? Do we have people that are carrying this? The concept is there. So I'm just kind of disappointed that the state of New Mexico attempts to put the blame with the districts. And I think that we just need to stand our grounds and move forward. There's got to be other meetings to come, many more meetings to come to accomplish what needs to be done. But I do want to say that the presentations, the graphs and the numbers provided were very informative. And I do thank you. And I haven't seen a lot of people in a long time, so it's good to see your pictures. And Daniel Sol, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Arvizo. Dr. Gray Eyes, would you like to respond?
Yes. Good morning, Dr. Arvizo. I really appreciate your questions. And I guess I want to tackle the first one you stated about where is University of New Mexico. UNM has a very stringent process in terms of getting legislation passed through, the role that Dr. Dameron plays in helping to support the professors, the departments that want to initiate these legislative moves. So this is kind of why it's a process. So you don't really see a lot of bills being stacked up and loaded into the legislative process each year. So that's kind of one part of that story, is understanding there's a process that we have to abide by. The second part, and I brought it up in the presentation, I probably didn't really articulate this very well, but coming from a post-secondary position as an educator, you look at how the post-secondary domain is articulated. How are they understanding our relationship to the Yazzie Martinez case? How are they articulating our relationship even to the communities and the work that's happening out there? I did see analysts who really are supposed to be providing the objective lens in terms of thinking about the lawsuit. What are some of the outcomes of that? And how does the role of post-secondary education play? And the comment from one of the analysts stated that, there's not a direct link of post-secondary that impacts that K through 12 domain. And to me, when I brought this to our IAIE faculty, that says a lot. There's obviously a whole educational campaign that we need to roll out in terms of showing what the post-secondary domain offers the K through 12 arena. And I think, there's that gap there that exists is really, it hurts us because we are ready to publish, ready to create curriculum, ready to create resources for K through 12. And we are asked that all the time. Can you do this? Can you create this? Can you write this? Can you research this? Or be part of these grants and initiatives? And, a lot of our faculty who work with their communities, they're really stretched thin. They donate and volunteer a lot of their time. They don't get paid for it. But, you know, that's not the point. It's that we are active agents addressing this legislative process. And then you ask, what is going on? I mean, that's the whole point of the PowerPoint. There's so many legislative initiatives happening and so little is coming out of it. And we need to be cognizant, because the players here in this conversation right now, we've all testified, we've all written letters, we've all served as a witness, we've pushed back on some of these initiatives being pushed forward. I mean, it's exhausting. And we're going to be hitting year 4 of trying to find those remedies that are hard hitting, that really address some of these issues. But a lot of these initiatives that come from our communities that do have tribal resolutions or letters from our president, they fall to the wayside. So, you know, I think the PowerPoint is showing that, you know, those legislations that really hit at the heart and soul of the Martinez Yazzie lawsuit, they don't get through. And I think Dr. Dameron did a really great job of elaborating on why that is, you know. So I think there's a lot to think about. And as we start to begin that slow roll again, start building our momentum and figuring out which lawsuits our legislation we're gonna actually start reinvesting our energy into, we need to rethink our strategy. Why did they fail? Why did so much of it fail? So I think that's a really important question for all of us to think about in our later discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Gray Eyes, Dr. Arvizo. I would like to go ahead and bring this part of the summit to conclusion, which was the panel. But I do want to thank the panelists again, Ms. Andrea Thomas, Mr. Daniel So, Chairman Wilfred Padilla, and Superintendent Mike Hyatt. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. You're all in different geographic places, but you do so much for all of us. And so I want to thank you very much. And I hope you have a great summer. And again, I hope you can stay on with us. And if not, we completely understand. I know you're all very busy people. So I guess we'll go ahead and have groups present. We had 4 groups, and I would like to ask the moderator, the discussant. We're going to go last. My group will go last, but I'd like to ask one of the discussants to either you share the highlights of your conversation, or if you want to ask someone in the group to share the highlights, that's up to you. But who would like to go first? Anybody who was a discussant? Okay, Terry.
I'll go first. I tried to take some notes. We had a fantastic discussion. Oh my gosh, I learned so much. Some of the things that I wrote down that we discussed were the fact that there is and Mr. Chino can jump in if I'm saying this wrong, that there's a tribal remedy framework that has already been developed.
No,
and we really need to all get together and support that tribal remedy framework that has already been approved by the tribal councils and such. That was one comment, that it would be a great framework in terms of moving forward. Also, we need to prioritize. So there's so many needs and there's so many things that we can ask for, should ask for, but moving forward, maybe as one strategy would be to prioritize a few of them and really focus on a few priorities. Another comment that perhaps we need an adequacy study. So in terms of what funding do we need to fund the mandates? What amount would we need? We talked about the roles of principals and superintendents, that they should take more of a role and be more involved, reach out to them. Also, another comment was, let's get the students involved, that the students really don't have a voice as it's set up right now, but they have so much to say and they're really articulate, and we need to reach out and include the students in the conversation. We need to re-envision what it means to have an adequate or excellent education. It may not be the same as what it was even 5 years ago. So that maybe, again, revisiting what that actually means. And finally, it was mentioned that we should be looking at the national level and some of the things that are happening nationally, such as the Indian Education for America and using social justice frameworks in our approaches.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. Wendy, Dr. Gray Eyes.
So we had quite a few recommendations, and I think I'm going to focus more on the solution-oriented elements. We had the strategy of actually, rather than focusing on traditional pathways of bills, starting with committees that actually have monies. One recommendation I know that Christy Chapman had brought up was working and starting with the House Taxation Committee first, rather than the House Education Committee. So, transforming how we approach our legislative moves. And then secondly is thinking about empowering our grassroots movements. Apparently our state legislators, and what's very evident in our analysis is that a lot of those memorials and bills and resolutions, they die. And because of that, we need to rethink, how do we build coalitions? How do we unify the resources that we have? But also going back to Terry's point, like, we need to focus on the hard-hitting bills that actually target the heart and soul of the Martinez-Yazzie ruling. The other element that we talked about is the equity councils. As you guys know, when New Mexico Public Education Department actually asked for a dismissal of the lawsuit, they highlighted equity councils as a strategy that's actually in play to resolve the remedy concerns. And one of our students, Songtree Pioche, has actually been trying to get into one of these equity councils. It's very regimented. She also said, even if we're not part of it, they should have and adhere to open public meeting laws so that there is a level of transparency. I think any public funded, publicly organized group needs to create this transparency with those groups so we know what's happening on the ground floor, because a lot of decisions get determined by these equity councils. She also brought up the need to educate more of our legislators about the structures of education within tribal communities. And she sees that operating more with the professional development, because many of our legislators don't realize that we do have tribal education departments within the 23 pueblos, tribes, and nations that operate within the nation. Ms. Gloria Hale made some really powerful points. She also brought up that, we don't see results of our work until 3, 4, 5 years afterwards. And, that we need to really think and reevaluate the progress that we've made, and really hold INMPED and all these entities that have initiate these projects to really create the reform to resolve those Yazzie Martinez remedies that are put out there, and really think about what our best practices is. But she says it's going to take time, and that as we progress even within INMPED, we need to set a timeline on a lot of these initiatives. As you guys know, just from the legislative discussion, there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of indexes that are built. I mean, there's still a lot of that preparation of these initiatives that is still in that state. It's not in that implementation stage. So, thinking about the process of actually getting and pushing those agendas to actually generate those reports, generate that analysis, generate those indexes quickly, but ensuring that, as Andrea had mentioned, that the teachers are at the table, the parents are at the table, and understanding exactly how, the reality of the data is actually constructing and reconstituting our students. And then Ms. Chischili had brought up that, obviously there's a litany of problems that are out there, but in terms of thinking about that we have to hold each other accountable, that we need to be more collaborative. We can't be operating in our own sandboxes, that, this has been the problem. 107 pieces of legislation, and they're coming from all over the place, all different people coming out of the woodwork. And we're not engaging in terms of our specific priorities, or there's an expectation that the priorities are being articulated to others. We can't make that assumption anymore. We have to make sure that those principles, and I've heard the tribal remedy brought up, but Ms. Chapman had brought up the Transform Education Group has a set of principles and making sure that we're articulating the basis of those principles to legislators, to collaborators, to all of our allies in terms of thinking about this process. I mean, there's a whole set of other recommendations that I think summarizes a lot of what we stated.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. Does anybody want to question or anybody have any remarks or questions for what either Terry or Dr. Flowerday or Dr. Gray Eyes presented? And then we'll go on to Lloyd to just give us the highlights of your discussion. Would anybody have any comments or questions?
This is Chairman Herrera.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation for the work groups. Specific to the tribal remedy framework, following Conroy Chino's presentation, I chimed in. And what I just want to present is that as you asked for solutions, strategies, specific strategies, we believe the tribal remedy framework takes into consideration all the prior efforts. It even had to discuss the prior administration under Governor Susana Martinez, where there wasn't that support and work. And then we come to the Grisham administration, who's more, favorable and a better environment that we're able to have some support and some laws and efforts, enacted. And then the real key is that as this summit is going forward, as you're asking us to do, what strategies do we now look to and deploy to go forward? The tribal remedy framework is what out of our work group is being suggested, because it accounts for all the considerations we believe that you're talking about. The other thing is that, I'll end with this, the tribal remedy framework, Transformation New Mexico, Center Law and Property, all these have all had a say in this. And it has been endorsed by the 22 tribes in New Mexico. The Navajo Nation has endorsed the tribal remedy framework and supports that. The Hickory Apache tribe, the Muscular Apache tribe, and then APCG, the All Public Council of Governors, the 20 pueblos that comprise the organization. The total tribes in New Mexico are on board with the tribal remedy framework. And again, just to emphasize that instead of recreating the wheel, but looking at how we can move forward, that's why we have brought this for your consideration. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to Lloyd. Would you like to do a presentation of highlights of your group?
Yeah, I can kind of give you an overview, a real quick overview, but I can also ask Dr. Martinez if she kind of wants to fill in a little bit with some of the details. But I think our conversation was pretty rich because we really focused on some of the things that are not necessarily related to just legislation in terms of strategies. And so some really key highlights came out in the rich conversation that we had. One of those highlights is the lack of communication and the lack of awareness about this particular lawsuit and about what the responsibilities are from the state to that lawsuit. So there's a lack of awareness and there's a lack of communication, particularly for parents and children and communities. They're not aware of it, and what is the responsibilities? That was one of the highlights that came out in our discussion. Another was really a lack of consensus and leadership, particularly from the community point of view. I think, we do have tribal leadership, we do have tribal officials that are part of this, but I think there's also sort of this thought that there's no one driving the car, or no one driving the truck, I should say, and that we're all kind of going along on the same path, but we're not really going along on the same path because we're all taking it in our own little different ways. I think that was another thing that came out. And then one last thing was really about the children in terms of what has taken place during the pandemic. and their education, and the lack of understanding of what the students have gone through and the children have gone through in the past year and a half, and the impact that that has, and how, while the lawsuit addresses those issues prior to the pandemic, I think that the pandemic reveals that it is much more dire in terms of what is happening with the children at this moment. But those are some quick highlights. But Dr. Martinez, did you want to go ahead and add a few more things?
Oh, thanks, Dr. Lee. Yeah, we had, I really enjoyed listening to our conversation, very heartfelt, and a couple of things that I wanted to point out as well, thinking about the levels of accountability that have been put into place that really we haven't seen, talking about equity councils, and the equity councils not actually happening. The meetings aren't taking place, and they're not serving the purpose, their intended purpose. And so, that's really concerning. The other thing was really just about access. I mean, access continues to be an issue for a lot of people. And like Dr. Lee said, just having everybody on the same page, because there are so many different, hands involved. I think that was the word that was used. So many different hands involved that it's losing a lot of the impact and a lot of the power. The movement is losing a lot of the impact and power that it could have, and it just needs to, everyone who's involved really just needs to come back together to reset, to remind of the intent and purpose originally, and to be able to move forward as a unit. And so thank you for the opportunity to be able to chime in.
Great, great. Well, we have a last group. We had 4 groups, and I had the honor and pleasure of working with Dr. Danielle Lansing. And so it's always nice to work with her. Thank you, Danielle, for taking great notes and participating as well in the discussion. We had some really good discussion in which we had a number of perspectives. Some of the highlights about what strategies should we focus on in 2022. Dr. White talked about the formula, that we need to fix the formula grant. Ms. Vivian Montoya talked about teaching and the importance of focusing on what teaching is going on. She talked about having data days, but we're bombarded with people coming in to telling us what we already know. Beverly, who's a parent as well as an active member in the Indian Education Committee in the Shiprock area, said it's important to her as a parent to keep abreast of what's going on in the classroom. She said, regarding equity councils, parent roles, there are parents who try to stay involved, but there's room to improve the inclusion of parents. Andrea talked about, as a teacher, talked about they need more resources for teachers to have time, that time is precious. The other question we talked about was what thoughts and questions were raised for you from the panel. What was pretty interesting was Dr. Russell talked about, I'm just going to do a direct quote. I think it's a direct quote. He said, "It struck me how disorganized this is, not the presentation of data, okay, but the whole existence of the data. What is the role of the communities and institutions? It looks to the legislatures that we are trying to attain something for ourselves. You're fighting amongst yourselves. That's easy to dismiss. It should be one bill so everyone is supported as a whole. We should not be pitted against one another." And he was talking about how you have the Diné colleges, like you have SIPI, you have Diné College, NTU, you have all these colleges, and then you have all these like New Mexico Highlands, Northern New Mexico, UNM. And although we want to collaborate, sometimes it looks like we're fighting against each other for resources, and it doesn't look good. It's not a good presentation of what we need to do. And Regis Pecos talked about, well, he said, there's a fundamental disconnect. He said there are only 3 bills that carry the bulk of the tribal remedy framework. He referenced House Bill 85, 86, and 87. And so we had a very, very lively conversation. And toward the end of our conversation, we talked about some other issues that are there. And again, I'm going to go back to Dr. Russell. He said, we need a better story to tell. And I think he talked about having a narrative that may not necessarily include every unique perspective of the 23 Native nations that cover 3 different states, but something that we can present and do what Barbara Damron talked about, which is be able to give this to a legislator and work with that legislator to get it through the process. So it seems like there's multiple tasks involved in this from what I got from my group. Danielle, are you still here? You want to add anything to this?
No, I think you did a great job summing it up, and it was really a pleasure hearing all the various levels of voices, and that's what I really love about this summit.
Oh, thank you. All right, we have one more presentation of group 3, and that's Toby. Dr. Holmes, would you like to present?
I was with Terry, and so Terry got
okay, all right.
Terry got a lot of our ideas. I think that a couple things that really stood out to me again was that idea of advocacy, that idea of really thinking about how we need to be better communicating together, and this idea that what is our ultimate vision, and this idea of revisioning. What is our ultimate goal that we're really striving for? What are we really looking for boys and girls to really receive ultimately in the form of an adequacy study, possibly? Really, what is it that we really need in order to deliver what the boys and girls not should have, but ultimately deserve and expect as a high quality educational environment in the state of New Mexico? So we had a great conversation, and I think those are some of the key takeaways that I walked away from.
Okay, great. So I guess we're going to bring some more closure to this. Does anybody from the larger audience want to say anything before we bring closure?
Yes, I would like to, if I may. I've been very impressed with everything I've heard and seen with this group and with the people here. And what I've just gathered from the presentations of the groups, I think there are probably three major overall things that we need to collaborate. All the groups have to get together and collaborate and come up with, those things that are key to ensuring the success of our children, education, our communities. So we have to collaborate, and then we have to consolidate, what is it that we really want to do, and we have to do it together. And then educate. And when I'm talking about educating, it's talking about educating those, if I may say it this way, the white folks in our community, the legislators who don't, I think, truly understand our story. And I think it's important for them to understand our story. It's important for them to reflect on their experiences, where they're coming from, why they react to what we're suggesting, what we know is needed, why they react in certain ways, so that then they can bring about change in themselves, and we can have allies and advocates, rather than feeling like we're always, hitting our heads against the wall trying to convince people, because I think that, change has to come from them as well. So I would, say collaborate, consolidate, educate. And I think that by bringing all of these ideas together, we can move forward together as one group, rather than trying to, even among ourselves, trying to push, one idea over the other.
I like that. Sounds like a t-shirt. Collaborate, consolidate, and I forget what the other one is.
Educate.
Educate, yeah. There you go. Okay. All right. Anybody else with any comments?
I have a quick comment, sorry.
Oh, okay, Joaquin, yes.
Just briefly, my name is Joaquin Preston with the National Indian Education Association. So I am the Tribal State Policy Associate. It's a relatively new position that's kind of been, that was established when ESSA was passed. And now this position is just now coming back. So I've been kind of keeping an eye on everything going on in New Mexico. But I think to kind of piggyback on what was said a little earlier, one of the strategies that we're finding particularly useful for states is by linking up the specific legislation with national, what's going on in other states and other legislatures. And it's been particularly interesting. We're kind of using the naming and shaming kind of thing, where we're looking at conservative states, red states that are actually passing Indian education for all legislation, and using that to kind of shame legislators who view themselves as progressive, or in this case, New Mexico, which has a strong tie to tribal communities, at least aesthetically. They try to use a lot of that imagery, and it's been nationally, it's been interesting to see a lot of more conservative states kind of going along the line of Indian education for all. And I know Indian education for all legislation isn't exactly legislation that's similar to what's in the tribal Yazzie Martinez framework. But I think that a strategy that looks nationally to say, look what these other legislatures are proposing and look how they're advancing with their relationship to tribal communities in these states, using kind of that language. It may not be useful for every legislature, but or every legislator, but I think a message like that can be used effectively when you're kind of butting heads against certain political actors.
Thank you, Mr. Preston. Okay. Dr. Arvizo.
Yes, I want to say that I think it's good that the comments were made, the participation was there. I want to recommend that we have a short-term plan and a long-term plan. What is it that can be accomplished? What will happen from here? Are we going to wait and have a meeting next year? Or are we going to come back together in a virtual meeting again, and when? And the information, the notes that resulted from this meeting needs to be shared. You know, this is high tech, is the way of the future now. So all the information should be shared. So there's a session coming up at the state legislature. So is anything going to be presented? If not, when is I guess I'm looking for a timeline for this year from here on out, because we need to move on this. And a lot of the information that was shared, comments that were shared, I mean, Conroy is a walking encyclopedia with all the information about the transactions that have happened. But keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arvizo, Dr. Arvizo, I appreciate that. Like last year, we will be creating an executive report, a summary of what happened here. It will be short. We strive to make this no more than 5 pages because it's an executive summary. So all the participants here will be getting a copy of that. I don't know how quickly we'll be able to turn that around because we have a lot of other projects going on, but Dr. Arvizo, you will receive an executive summary from that. And we will have another summit next year. It won't be virtual, it will be in person. So we can share a meal and enjoy one another and have some good conversation. So thank you, Ta'a. Anybody else? Wendy? Okay.
I know Brianna and I had done a lot of the reading of the legislative memorials and so forth. And, I think, when you come away after kind of filling your brain with all of this information, I mean, one thing that really becomes very evident is that what is our end game? I mean, when do we know exactly when, every child who is Native American gets everything that they need? Because everyone kind of came with different strategies from their own pockets and their own spaces. And even us, the Institute for American Indian Education, we're constrained by our own institutional barriers. And I think when we move forward, I think we're not going to be able to collaborate as effectively. And I hate to be the naysayer, but I really feel like we're still going to be confined by these institutional boundaries that exist. And somehow we need to think about, engaging the dialogue. But I think there's been just so much legislation put out there. And some of it were just really targeted to our tribal communities, meaning the boundaries of the reservation. Something that's really, that we haven't talked about is 72% of American Indians live off a reservation. And that's just in New Mexico. So a majority of our kids are not even attending the schools in our communities, aren't part of a BIE or a tribally controlled school, our school on the reservation. And, I even know for Navajo Nation, there's just such a huge outmigration. You're seeing school enrollment decline. My community, Kienta, after the Peabody coal mine shut down, the enrollment dropped there. So I think, when we think about the future, I also get really worried that sometimes we think of this tribal community as, the reservation space. but somehow we need to rethink how do we build this collaborative perspective that engages the urban realities that are hitting our communities. But I think, there's also the LESC report. There's 15 initiatives in that. So you guys know they had their work plan and their staff session for the Legislative Education Study Committee. They have 15 priorities. And to me, that's overwhelming as well in terms of how do they address all of that, because it is such a variety of educational priorities. And I just wonder, how do we tackle that? How do we integrate that? Because I don't really see, and I'm reading through it, I don't see hardly any references to a tribal remedy framework as the driving light for this document. And, I think we need to really think about, the realities of some of our initiatives and how do we make that the priority? How do we rebuild that? So there's a lot of dilemmas that I'm putting out there, but I think there's still a lot of conversation that we need to have on this issue. So those are my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. I think our last word is going to go to Governor Herrera.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to kind of go off of what Wendy just now presented. I appreciate that, Wendy. What I'm going to say, I hope it's not offensive to anybody, but building on what she said about, what is our end goal? What are we trying to overall impact in trying to educate our people, our children, our students? So what I'm going to maybe offer to all of us, think about how we, in a sense, how we define that successful person, a student. I've said this in past discussions, education meetings, forums in this way, that as tribal communities, not only PO, but tribal communities, what do we envision as a successful human being? And for particularly our youth and young adults, our children, grandchildren, it seems like to me, we have to define it where we find a balance for them. In what we're seeking is not only, as Wendy said, we're educated in the mainstream. A lot of people are navigating out. That's okay. But when we try to incorporate the cultural language and history of our native peoples to try to balance that for our individual, is that the way we would define then that we're successful? By a person being able to be educated or trained in a good way so that they can have these opportunities in life that, we all want them to be blessed with. But on the other side, we talk about the ability for ourselves and our younger generations to continue to foster, protect, and preserve our culture, language, and tradition. So if we can achieve a balance to get a well-rounded individual to have those things within them and in their life, I believe that we have succeeded and they can go forward to carry on the work and all the things that we've been entrusted with to do. All of us on this forum today, we all probably have had these advisements and, remember your people, remember the education that you've been blessed with. Go back and help your people. But some may say, okay, but I'm going to work out there. I'm going to work out in the city, in the mainstream. And so I'm going to help people there. That's okay. That's part of this well-rounded individual trying to do the best they can to make a positive impact in the world. So I think at some point, I've never really seen that really about how we define what that person should be, and how we're trying to work through 2 worlds, maybe 3 worlds sometimes, in how we, and I don't want to confuse our children, our students. I want to make it clear to them, this is my expectation, and I'm here to help guide you and advise you, but you got to make good, well-informed decisions that are going to impact you in a positive way. But here are the resources, and here are the things that are available to you, and hopefully I can provide those to you as a community member, as a family member, as a tribal leader. Just that's all I wanted to say. Also, thank you.
Thank you. I always like listening to you speak, as we do with elders in general, because there's a blessing embedded inside of your words of guidance, and that's always something I think that we have as Indigenous peoples, especially those of us who speak our native language, are familiar with our cultural traditions, grew up at home, and so on. So I appreciate that, Ta'a. Dalba, thank you very much for that. That was very good of you, because I felt the blessing in that. And I like the fact that as we come to the end of the summit, that you bring it back to putting the child at the center. The child, Kim Uwain, our little children, putting our kids at the center with their families and our cultural traditions. I think that's what's going to center us, because sometimes everything gets a little convoluted. It gets complicated when you start thinking about all these other issues. And it's not that those things aren't important, but I like to think of us that ultimately it's about what are we doing for our kids, and what is, when we tell them to go out and do well in school, what does that really mean? What does it mean when we do the prayers for them when they graduate from high school and go on to college? What do we say for them when they meet an academic award? I mean, I've had the honor of being bestowed upon through NAC meetings, through my own Tausways, prayers for me, and I probably wouldn't have been here without those prayers, without people, going to the river or praying at midnight, and then in the morning when they bring the water in. Those things wouldn't have happened for me had that not happened. So what can we do to keep that, to maintain that, and not let it get convoluted, so I just want to thank everybody for doing this. I get a lot out of this. I have to say there's a lot of preparation for this 5-hour session, and a little stressful sometimes. But at the end, I just think it worked out just fine. And I have to tell myself that at 3 a.m. when I'm worried about things. But it worked out just fine, I think. And you're right, Dr. Arvizo, we need to know what's a timeline, what's the next part. And I think we have some good people here. You have a good generation here with Dr. Gray Eyes and Lloyd, this new crop of professors that you have coming through, and people like myself on my way out. It's good because it's going to keep replenishing, and I think that's good. So thank you, everybody.